Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the Schiller Institute, it is my absolute, there is an echo. Can you get rid of that, please? There is a very joyous moment today as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And this is a truly universal event and an event which unites all of humanity. In 1969, there were 500 million people who watched the who watched um, the landing of the moon, and it caused an incredible inspiration and excitement at the time. Now you can be sure that today, where communication is so much better, where already in the last several weeks there were millions of people watching programs from the past, documentaries, that it will be again hundreds of millions of people who will unite and celebrate this incredible event. Now, in 69, it was every seventh human being on the planet. Now, the reason why space is so absolutely important is because it has everything to do with the identity of mankind. As my late beloved husband, Lyndon LaRouche, said, space is the proof that the human species, that we are not earthlings, that we are a spacefaring nation, and that we all have the divine spark of reason, which makes sure that each individual of us is capable of limitless self-perfection, to study and discover ever more better the laws of the physical universe. Or as our dear friend and the great space pioneer Kraft Erike said, it's the Homo sapiens extraterrestris, the man who is actually the man in space. Now, the joyous thing is that today, after literally decades of a hiatus of cutting back in funding for NASA and a very poor funding of ESA, the perspective of the industrialization of the moon and a colony on Mars is fully back on the agenda. Now, as Dennis just mentioned, President Trump said he will, or the United States will put a man and a woman on the moon by 2024. And the Chinese, for the occasion of this 50th anniversary, just reactivated their Chang'e 4 lunar mission, a rover and a lander on the backside of the moon. Now, today also postponed for this date, a Soyuz launcher has taken off from Baikonur, carrying a Russian, an American, and an Italian to go to the next period, to the ISS. The Italian Luca Parnitano, who will be the commander on the ISS in the second part of this mission, said, what we do on the ISS is for the Earth, it's for all of humanity. Also, for this occasion, the Indian Chandrayaan-2 project, a mission to the South Pole of the moon, which will investigate the ice in the craters of the South Pole on the moon, has just slightly been postponed, but it's supposed to land on the moon in September. Also, from Russia, Dmitry Rogozin, the head of Roscosmos, sent his congratulations to the NASA head Bridenstine, praising the three original astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, and all the great space pioneers before them, because they dared to set off the journey to the unknown in order to push the boundaries of the reachable world for all of humanity. Now, if one thinks about the vastness of the universe, what is known so far through the pictures of the Hubble telescope, at least 2 trillion galaxies. Recently, the proof was found that Einstein's assumption about gravitational waves is indeed the reality, and also that it could be proven that the Einstein assumption of black holes indeed are at the center of each galaxy, which means we are living in a relativistic universe. Now, it is very clear, and this last example is the final proof if you needed one, because the imaging of these black holes could be only accomplished because 8 countries from across the globe put their radio telescopes together to be able to make such an image. Now, this most important message, therefore, is space research and travel requires international cooperation and not confrontation. Therefore, we are not involved or should not be involved in a, quote, race to the moon or race to Mars, but this is the unique chance for progress beyond the geopolitical competition among countries, and that we have to look at the future in space from the standpoint of the common interest of all of humanity. Now, there are several reasons for the absolute necessity of space research and travel and colonization. From the negative side, well, one single large asteroid would be enough to eliminate all of civilization and everything beautiful mankind has ever produced, from the great dramas of Shakespeare to the great compositions of Beethoven. Therefore, we need the strategic defense of the Earth, the international cooperation of all nations. But the positive side is, if you look at the long arc of human evolution, how man in a relatively short period of time, given the year or the years of the universe at large, man has developed from a caveman using hand axes to kill his fellow man to the kind of reasonable international cooperation which we see on the ISS since a long time. It is international cooperation in space, which is also therefore the next phase of the evolution of mankind, where we as a human species develop from rowdy teenagers to beautiful souls in the sense of Schiller, that freedom and necessity, duty and passion are one and the same thing. Or as Kraft-Erike said, man is guided by the extraterrestrial imperative. Now, space research and travel and colonization has everything to do with the image of man and the cultural optimism which is the basis for this creativity and the true freedom of man. It is the most powerful proof that we are not living in an earthbound system with limited resources. And this idea of an earthbound system is the entire basis for the existence of the ecology movement, which recently has turned into an extinction hysteria movement, causing complete cultural pessimism and despair. Let's look back 90 years ago. In 1929, Fritz Lang made this incredible movie, The Woman in the Moon, which was a beautiful polemical argument against all backwardness and anti-technological sentiment. Now, the scientific advisor of this was Hermann Oberth, one of the outstanding pioneers of rocketry and space and astronautics. This movie was the inspiration of many of the space pioneers to follow. One of them, the outstanding Kraft-Erike, who was then himself an important contributor to the Atlas rocket. He was the director of the Centaur program. And already in the 50s and the 60s, he developed an incredibly far-sighted vision of the moon as the stepping stone to the colonization of Mars, and then finally the entire solar system. Now, 40 years after The Woman in the Moon, an event takes place today, the event took place which we celebrate today, the landing of Apollo 11 on the moon. which indeed meant a great leap for mankind. But interesting, yesterday, Mike Collins, the second astronaut, or no, the astronaut which did not go on the moon, but which was in the orbit, he basically made the point that for him, an even bigger turning point was the fact of Apollo 8, which meant that for the first time, a human being had completely escaped Earth's gravity into space. Now, this is something worth to reflect about, because that man is able or was able to leave the surface of the Earth and get out into space is not a self-evident question. And already that is the absolute proof that we are not living in an Earth-bound system. That first human being walking on the moon caused at the time a complete explosion of optimism in the whole world. But it was also very clear that the national oligarchy was not amused about that idea, because their entire power is based on the idea that the masses of the population think about themselves as underlings, that they are pessimistic about their future. So already in 1964, various studies and polls started to investigate, quote, the impact of space programs on the different sectors of the population. And one famous report under the direction of a certain Mr. Rappaport, an anthropologist from the Northwestern University and the Committee on Space, wrote the second order consequences, a methodological essay on the impact of technology, written then by Reber. The thesis of that report was that the space program had produced a dangerous outbreak of cultural optimism, of the belief that creative scientific thinking could solve any problem on the planet. The oligarchy immediately launched the Club of Rome against this optimism and their fraudulent limits to growth, with the idea that man is bound by the earth, that the resources are limited, and we have to go into a zero growth mode. At the same time, Harris and Gallup produced polls to supposedly show that Americans oppose the continued expenditures of manned spaceflight. These polls influenced the election campaign between 1970 and 72, and the scaling back of the funding of the space program became an election issue. Now, that all led to a relative standstill, at least concerning the American space program. So when in 1984, there was this conference in honor of Kraft Erika, who had just passed away and who had become, in the meantime, a very close friend and collaborator of the Schiller Institute. There was a discussion between my husband and some of the participants of this conference of the proposal to pick up his idea of a permanent colony on Mars, which Linda LaRouche then discussed in the absolute incredible movie of which you saw the beginning, Woman on Mars, which was published in 1987. In this movie and writings accompanying it, Lynn basically said that already 1 year later, after the Kraft-Erike conference, the National Commission on Space adopted a plan to do exactly that, to develop a decade-long program for the colonization of Mars, which then was endorsed by President Reagan. Now, Lynn basically said that the Mars colonization project would, and this was a hopeful prediction, would then be part of the State of the Union address of the next president of the United States in 1989. But as it turned out, it was Bush Sr. who was that president, so no such thing occurred. And instead, Bush was very instrumental in not only putting Lynn into jail, but with him the entire body of ideas he represented. So Lynn had developed in many writings before, including The Woman on Mars, the beautiful vision to have a colony on Mars by 2027. He also said, if the NASA program after the Apollo landing would not have been scaled down, a colony on the moon would already have been possible by 1986. So then he defined the next 40-year perspective, how to step by step get the necessary breakthroughs for this plan. It required a breakthrough in thermonuclear fusion, because to get to the moon takes 3 days, but by conventional means to get to the Mars is 8 months, which the human body cannot master. It requires the continued acceleration until half of the journey, and then the de-acceleration for the second part. It required a breakthrough in lasers and other directed electromagnetic pulses as a basic tool, the development of optical biophysics and more powerful computer systems, higher energy density on Mars itself for terraforming, the creation of domes, an artificial atmosphere, the second generation of thermonuclear fusion. Lynn developed 6 phases: the industrialization of the moon, self-sustaining supplies of foodstuffs and materials from the moon, agricultural, industrial development, linked satellites in the orbit around Mars, a complete astrophysical observation complex, a Mars orbit space terminal for delivery of materials for the construction of a permanent habitation on the surface of on Mars. Lynn was thinking 2 to 3 generations ahead, with the idea that this project would require eventually tens of thousands of scientists and engineers to build such a colony, and eventually building colonies on the scale of important cities on the Earth, namely millions of people. That is in principle where we are now. What President Trump has announced to soon raise the American flag on Mars. And he also promised that it would be international cooperation. This is what China is about to launch next year, testing if terraforming is possible on Mars. The Chinese already have a model of this Mars colony in the desert of Gobi, where the Chinese astronauts had landed. It's called the Huaxing 1Hao GD Mars Basis number 1, a model space station where quarters are for living, recycling, growing of plants for food, and nearby training centers are being erected, hotels, because there is a tremendous excitement in the Chinese youth to get involved in space research and travel. Now, Lynn had the vision of international space cooperation because it is, like nothing else, developing the spark of reason, with the idea that each useful idea is for the benefit of all of humanity. And Lynn also was absolutely optimistic about the idea that space travel is increasing the goodness in people and is improving the moral character. Kraft Erika was so much in front of the Schiller Institute because he recognized that the aesthetical education was absolutely crucial to go along with the technological and scientific progress for the ennoblement of the human being. Now, Lynn, in various writings, was very optimistic that through space, the development, the moral development and intellectual development of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren would be much of a much better quality than we live it today. It is only through the colonization of the moon, Mars, the solar system, that man can become the immortal species. There are 2 important lessons from the last 50 or even 90 years of space research and development. First, we absolutely must have a sufficient continuous funding to never have again such setbacks as we have experienced it over the last 40 years. And we must absolutely have a United Space Alliance, international cooperation, and overcome confrontation forever. It is this moment to absolutely return to the optimistic image of man, that mankind is the only creative species known in the universe so far, and that it is our task to multiply and subdue, no, not the Earth, but the entire solar system and maybe beyond. Why should we do that? Because we are human. We have in us an innate goodness, a capacity for agape, and all the evil in the world is only the result of a lack of development, which we will remedy through space travel. Thank you.